We're going to have our sixth presentation now. I'm happy to introduce Samantha Messeck. So Samantha is a licensed social worker and graduate of Rutgers School of Social Work. Samantha coordinates the Inclusive Healthy Communities program and school-based counseling programs and services as an outpatient therapist at Gateway Wellness Center across South Jersey. Her work supports youth, families, and individuals with cognitive, behavioral, and developmental disabilities, with a focus on mental health awareness, accessibility, and community engagement. As a neurodivergent clinician with lived experience, Samantha is passionate about inclusive, strengths-based, and trauma-informed care. We are delighted to have Samantha with us today as a fellow Inclusive Healthy Communities provider. Here she is. She's presenting her workshop, Masking Misdiagnosis and Mental Health, Supporting Neurodivergent Clients Authentically. Please welcome Samantha.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for everyone who is on today and for all of the other speakers. I really enjoyed listening to everyone, and thank you for everyone who is still staying. I know it's been a long day, but I appreciate it. It's been great. All right, so my presentation focuses on masking misdiagnosis and the mental health impact experienced by neurodivergent individuals, particularly those who struggle that are often overlooked because they appear to be coping externally. So, this topic is especially important in mental health because individuals go years without understanding why everyday life feels harder than it appears for others. So, today we will discuss what masking is, why it happens, and how it contributes to misdiagnosis, and what authentic support can look like across schools and healthcare settings. So, both personally and professionally, this topic matters deeply to me through my work supporting neurodivergent youth and families in community mental health and school based settings. One thing that I've consistently observed is how often behaviors are interpreted before they are even understood. So many individuals spend years trying to fit expectations while struggling internally. Sometimes they are labeled as anxious, difficult, lazy, dramatic, oppositional, or overly sensitive before anyone underlines that recognizes that underlying neurodivergence. So this presentation is not about assigning blame, it's about increasing awareness, reducing stigma, and encouraging a more supportive and affirming approach. So, what is neurodivergence? That refers to natural differences in the way that people can think, learn, process information, communicate, and even just experiencing the world. So, rather than viewing these differences solely through a deficit lens, the neurodiversity paradigm encourages us to understand neurological variation as part of normal human diversity. So, this includes ADHD, autism, sensory processing differences, executive functioning challenges, dyslexia, or other neurodevelopmental differences. So, one important point is that neurodivergence is not always outwardly visible. Many individuals become highly skilled at compensating or masking, and I just want you to take a moment to think about how many of us were taught a very stereotypical presentation of what ADHD and autism looks like. And so, from my experience in working in school and community settings, that I've often seen students who appear bright, capable, and socially fine while privately experiencing overwhelm, exhaustion, constant anxiety, all while trying to keep up with expectations from society. Next slide, please. So this goes on to what is masking. So masking, which can also be called camouflaging, it happens when neurodivergent individuals consciously or unconsciously suppress traits or behaviors to appear more socially accepted. So for some people, masking can look like forcing eye contact, even when uncomfortable, rehearsing conversations beforehand, copying copying social behaviors, and hiding sensory distress, or constantly just monitoring how they appear to others. So it's important to understand that masking often develops as a survival strategy, not manipulation. So many individuals mask because they have repeatedly experienced criticism, bullying, rejection, punishment, or misunderstanding. And what can appear externally as doing fine may actually require an enormous amount of internal effort. So, a student can spend their entire day forcing eye contact, copying how other peers may socialize, staying quiet in class, and even suppressing sensory difficulties. So, teachers can describe them as polite and well behaved, but by the time they get home, they're completely shut down emotionally. And because they use all of their energy to appear normal throughout the day. So, one thing that I've personally observed is that many individuals, especially students, become experts at hiding this distress because they learn that being their authentic selves can lead to correction, judgment, just a lot of things that seems like other people don't really understand from their point of views. So, studies have increasingly linked masking with poor mental health outcomes, particularly anxiety, depression, and autistic burnout. Next slide, please. So, here I included a graph. So, this is just the overall cost of masking. So, what can happen when neurodivergent youth constantly hide who they are to fit in? So it starts off on the left, just as a constant self monitoring, always watching, adjusting, trying to get it right. And then on to social exhaustion, being drained from performing, people pleasing, just trying to hold it all together. Then anxiety and depression. So the pressure to mask, it contributes to chronic stress, worry, and feeling not enough. Then on to identity confusion. They lose touch of who they are beneath of that mask. Now, burnout can come from that physical, emotion, and mental exhaustion where they have finally hit that breaking point. And then beyond that is the delayed diagnosis and support. So when they really need that support, sometimes it's not there. And that real need remains unseen, misunderstood, and untreated, which prolongs that cycle. Next slide, please. All right, so why many go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed? So I want you to reflect a moment on the idea of spending years knowing something feels difficult, but continually being told that you're overreacting, you're being dramatic, you're too anxious, or you're just not trying hard enough. So many neurodivergent individuals are not missed because symptoms are absent. They are missed because the symptoms don't match outdated expectations. So, historically, diagnostic models are based heavily on young white boys with a more externalized presentation. So, as a result of that, individuals with more quieter symptoms, high academic achievement, internalized distress, or even strong social mimicry often go unnoticed. So many people receive diagnoses like anxiety, depression, but even bipolar disorder, personality disorders, and even behavioral problems before anyone even begins to explore the possible idea of neurodivergence underneath all of those symptoms. So that doesn't mean that these diagnoses are always incorrect. Co-occurring conditions absolutely exist. It happens all the time, but the underlying neurodivergence still remains unidentified. And so that's the real issue. So in some mental health settings, we often see clients who have spent years being treated for anxiety, depression, other mental health diagnosis without anyone recognizing the neurodivergence that is contributing to those struggles as well. So, some research has found that many autistic individuals, particularly women, and high masking individuals receive multiple mental health diagnoses before autism is ever identified. And I did include a study here through Healthline that 75% of participants receiving an autism diagnosis is usually approximately 8 years after their first mental health diagnosis. So I definitely wanted to include that there. Next slide, please. So, how many girls have grown up being called too sensitive, dramatic, perfectionists, or anxious without anyone asking you why you were struggling so hard internally? This is one of the most important conversations that are happening right now in neurodiversity awareness. So, girls and women are often socialized to be compliant, emotionally aware, socially attentive, and people pleasing. So, it's something that is just engraved in our bones from the time that we are children all the way up into adults, is basically, just doing what you're told, putting a smile on your face. And so, sometimes we're just naturally not being our true, authentic selves. So, because of this, many learn to mask extremely early. And so, instead of destructive behaviors, they may internalize that distress through the perfectionism, through the anxiety, and that emotional overwhelm, and chronic exhaustion, and then again, that social mimicry. So, many women report spending years feeling different without even understanding why. And so, a very common experience is adults recognizing their own traits only after their child receives a diagnosis. All right. And then I also want to add in that I think that many professionals are beginning to recognize how many individuals are overlooked because they didn't match those stereotypes that we were taught to recognize. So picture a student, who gets perfect grades, never causes problems, and is even constantly praised for their maturity. But meanwhile, that same child, she spends every evening being emotionally exhausted, replaying social interactions and feeling like she's failing despite appearing successful. Next slide, please. Culture and masking. I wanted to make sure I included this because an individual's culture can play a huge role, not only just on their neurodivergence, but how they may mask and how they present themselves, and also how they might suppress, certain symptoms. So, culture can strongly influence how neurodivergence is viewed, how it's discussed, or even how it is hidden. In some environments, there may be pressure to appear successful, emotionally controlled, and even respectful or compliant. And because of this, some individuals may mask even more heavily to avoid judgment, stigma, or even just disappointing others, disappointing their family. Cultural impacts can also impact whether families seek support, how behavior is interpreted, and also whether these struggles are minimized or simply overlooked and misunderstood. So, as professionals, it's important to recognize that neurodivergence does not exist separately from identity, culture, family expectations, or lived experience. Next slide, please. So now I just want to make you all aware of some commonly overlooked symptoms. So many symptoms are misunderstood because they don't fit the stereotypes, as I've said before. So to break that down a little bit more, for ADHD, emotional dysregulation, rejection sensitivity, or overwhelm, just difficulty initiating tasks are often overlooked. For autism, sensory overwhelm, scripting conversations, social exhaustion, shutdowns, or rigid thinking that can all be interpreted behaviorally rather than neurologically. So, a shutdown that can look like defiance, overwhelm can look like avoidance, and forgetfulness may be labeled as laziness. So, this is why understanding context matters. Next slide, please. So, the overall mental health impact. Masking has significant mental health consequences. Many neurodivergent individuals describe feeling like they are acting all day long, monitoring facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, eye contact, reactions, even just monitoring that social behavior constantly. So, what does that do to someone's identity when they feel safest being anyone other than themselves? I just want to take a moment to reflect on that. So, when individuals repeatedly receive the message that natural behaviors are wrong, that's when shame starts to develop. And over time, this can contribute to that burnout, the depression, the identity confusion, and even isolation. And unfortunately, that can lead to trauma responses. Neurodivergent individuals experience significantly high rates of anxiety, depression, self harm, and suicidal ideation compared to the general population. So, one powerful idea here is that repeated correction of natural behaviors can deeply impact a person's sense of self. Next slide, please. So, we talked about the different symptoms of ADHD and autism. We also talked about co occurring diagnoses, but how do these two separate diagnoses overlap within themselves? So, co-occurring conditions mean multiple challenges or diagnoses existing at the same time, and this can complicate the recognition of neurodivergence. So, anxiety, depression, trauma, OCD-like traits, those sensory differences, the executive functioning challenges, and even learning disabilities, they frequently overlap with each other. Now, sometimes clinicians focus on the most visible symptoms, what they see the most, what the parents are talking about, the different complaints from the teachers. And sometimes that can lead to missing the broader neurological picture, unless that someone really has that deep understanding or even the educational awareness. Sometimes it's really just not even thought about. For example, a person may present with anxiety, but all of that anxiety can stem from years of masking and even just sensory overwhelm, being extremely overstimulated. So, understanding that overlap can help avoid oversimplification. Next slide, please. So, now for how that can be impacted in a school setting. So, in schools, behavior is often interpreted before it is understood. Students may be labeled as defiant, disrespectful, lazy, and even attention seeking when they're actually just overwhelmed, dysregulated, and again, burnt out. So, not only do many students hold themselves together all day, as I said before, and then emotionally crash once they get home, not just due to failure, but also even just due to lack of, motivation. They've just kind of had enough of it. But attendance struggles can also reflect. It can be a result of anxiety, sensory overload, exhaustion, but also from that lack of knowing that they have that support within the school setting when they are there. So this shift from punishment to curiosity is incredibly important. Instead of causing, consequences for some of these actions, maybe looking a little bit more into, how you can better support those students. So a lot of students who can refuse to go to school and may appear oppositional on the surface, underneath they're just experiencing, the fear of repeated failure. If it hasn't been working all this time, they had a bad day at school today, they had a bad day at school yesterday. What is that difference going to be that tomorrow is going to be any better? Next slide, please. All right, so gifted but struggling. One major misconception is that academic success eliminates the possibility of disability or support needs. So many neurodivergent students compensate through intelligence or overworking, aiming for perfectionism. And externally, they may appear successful, but that exhaustion and the struggling with executive functioning is still there. So achievement does not always equal well-being. Some students may experience, well, some students become experts, I would say, at hiding difficulties because they fear disappointing others, but they also don't want to lose the identity of being that smart student. So some students become so skilled at compensating that adults only notice their struggles once they have already become completely burnt out. And so I wanted to just take a brief moment here to touch a little bit on my own experience. And I know that it's highlighted a little bit more in the Symposium blog. But when I was about 14, I was first diagnosed with ADHD. But this was after a, probably almost a decade of me struggling internally. I was in, gifted and talented. I had great grades. I had a really high IQ. I was at an extremely high reading level, for my age, but at the same time, I was in speech classes. I was having a hard time reading out loud because my brain was processing so much faster than my lips could move. Um, and that led to a lot of other things. As I got older, once I got into high school, I was having a really hard time with studying, math in particular. And it wasn't until I started to go to therapy, now I'm a therapist, but when I first went to therapy, that's when my therapist actually got me diagnosed with ADHD. And it's interesting because at that point, that's when my own mother realized that she had ADHD as well. And she went, her entire life struggling with it. I was able to get on medication at that time, and it was a lot easier for me to learn how to cope and get through school. But it just shows that because I was thriving so well, no one would have known until I started to open up a little bit. And I've noticed that a lot of very similar experiences with a lot of other students that I've worked with and with their parents as well. All right, next slide, please. So now for oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about the graphic. Okay, so yes, so myths versus reality. So I won't go into everything because some of it I've kind of touched on the other slides, but one in particular is autistic people lack empathy. So many autistic individuals experience empathy deeply, but may express emotions or social communication differently. Good grades equals no disability. Strong academics can mask anxiety, burnout, sensory overload, and emotional exhaustion. If they can do it sometimes, they can do it all the time. So, neurodivergent functioning often changes based on stress levels, the environment that we are in, sensory demands, and energy levels. And then they are just being difficult. Behaviors are often communicated as overwhelm, unmet needs, nervous system dysregulation, or just the overall exhaustion from masking. And a diagnosis limits potential. So I know I heard some of the other speakers mention this as well. These are abilities, not disabilities. There's so many wonderful things that go along with having ADHD, autism, so many skills that need to be focused on. So, an accurate diagnosis and support can improve self understanding, accommodations, mental health, and also long term success. So, understanding that person as a whole, not just their disability, leads to a more accurate support, stronger outcomes, and more inclusive communities. Next slide, please. Impact in healthcare settings. So, neurodivergent individuals often experience symptoms of being dismissed, minimized, or being misunderstood. And so, these healthcare environments are incredibly difficult for neurodivergent individuals. And the communication differences can also be misunderstood as noncompliance, exaggeration, anxiety, or even lack of cooperation. So many individuals mask distress during appointments, and this can cause providers to underestimate the severity of their struggles. sensory overload, processing delays, difficulty even just explaining the symptoms. And also medical anxiety. Those can all impact interactions that they have in these healthcare settings, whether it's just in the doctor's office, the hospital, even in, mental health settings when going to see a therapist and trying to explain, what is going on inside of them. So repeated invalidation can reduce trust in healthcare systems over time. So you just have to think. I mean, how long does it take for someone to just keep asking, repeatedly for help and then just continually being dismissed or misunderstood? Eventually, that leads to, giving up, feeling like no one will ever understand them. And that creates a stigma of their own identity, and can often lead to no longer seeking those resources and those supports when they feel like they're continually being shut down. Next slide, please. So, what would earlier understanding have changed? So, I just want you to think for a moment of what would change if someone grew up understanding themselves instead of constantly wondering what was wrong with them. How would that be different if all of a sudden, a lot of these misunderstandings all had a reason? So I think that many late diagnosed individuals describe a mixture of both grief and relief at the same time. So grief for years of feeling misunderstood, and then relief at the same time for finally having language for their experiences, finally being able to put that into words. So professionals earlier recognition can change how behaviors are interpreted and also how they are supported. For caregivers, understanding earlier how validating concerns and how that could have been dismissed for years. So, really understanding that impact for families. Now, for neurodivergent individuals themselves, early understanding can often mean less shame, less confusion, and earlier access to accommodations and self acceptance. Next slide, please. So, supporting neurodivergent youth authentically. For clinicians, so support does not mean lowering expectations. It really means removing unnecessary barriers. But at the same time, support first begins with understanding. So for educators, it means looking beyond stereotypes, using affirming language, person first language, assessing for masking, and focusing on their strengths. For me, I am a huge strengths-based person. There's no reason to always focus on all the negatives, what people are doing wrong, but instead focusing on all of the things that they are doing right, all the things that they are great at. Now, for parents and caregivers, it means shifting from punishment to curiosity, asking questions, assessing for masking, but then also creating an emotional safety rather than a shame at home. Home is where a child is supposed to feel the most safe. And when they don't get that, that's when it can start to cause issues within the relationships of a family as a whole. So now, authentic support is not about forcing neurodivergent individuals to appear neurotypical. It is about helping them function in ways that are sustainable and healthy at the same time. So let's see what happens when people start to feel safe enough as to stop pretending. So I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what I do within my organization. I know that it was mentioned, that I do work for the Gateway Wellness Center within Gateway Community Action Partnership, and I am a part of the Inclusive Healthy Communities Grant, and I am the coordinator for that program. But then I'm also the coordinator for the school-based counseling program within Cumberland County. And so within both programs, I go into schools and provide therapy for students. And this is great because a lot of kids, they have IEPs, they have these 504 plans and accommodations, but they don't really understand what these accommodations and what these diagnoses are. Same for parents. I'm able to communicate with their guardians and really help them providing, different tools, coping skills, whatever they may need. And sometimes this is very surface level, sometimes it's just behavioral issues, having some trouble with academics, but sometimes it goes a lot deeper than that. I know I touched a little bit about, bullying, but unfortunately, that leads to a lot of other things, including suicidal ideation, even addiction as a way of coping in an unhealthy way. And so, my hope is that this is an intervention that can also be a preventative measure as well. Now, I also have an inclusion specialist on my team who goes into the schools and hosts different groups of whether it's the 8 dimensions of wellness, tying in life skills, affirming language for the students. And the biggest focus is making sure that these groups of kids are not only students who are neurodivergent or have different learning or behavioral disabilities. We want to make sure that it's inclusive. So that way there is kids of all abilities, a very diverse population of kids. So that way they are all learning acceptance. Another part of this program is also doing staff development, webinars, presentations like this to really bring awareness to the community, to parents, to teachers, everyone who needs support. And, maybe even for individuals who, like me, until I got a higher education, until, I chose to be a social worker myself, things that I didn't even know, things that my family didn't know and weren't aware of. So this is just a first place to start. We've been doing advisory board meetings, inviting different organizations to get together to have these discussions. And another way that we're doing this is community events. We just hosted a wellness fair yesterday for the community. It was completely free. We had a sensory cool down tent for kids if they were starting to feel overstimulated. We offered earplugs, but we did have the DJ. We had a lot of fun games, so that way it was inclusive for everyone. Free food, and it was great seeing the community come out. And this is just one example, for a wide range of open mic nights, basketball tournaments. We're planning a field day this summer. And so I'm just really hoping that this is a way to bring down some of that stigma and expand that awareness. Now, I also do outpatient therapy, one-on-ones in my office instead of going into the school. So this is an option for the students over the summer, whether that's telehealth sessions to continue those services, which is great. And then a another thing is that I also do in-home therapy with students. And so this is apart from my program, but something that I do, personally. And that has been great because it's amazing working with these kids in their homes, working with their siblings, working with their parents, just the whole family unit, which is wonderful because then I can really meet them where they are. So that was all for that. So we can go on to the next slide. All right, so strengths and long-term success. Many neurodivergent individuals do not need to be fixed. They need environments where they are understood, supported, and allowed to function as themselves. So, one important part of this conversation is moving beyond deficit-only perspectives. Neurodivergent individuals often demonstrate creativity, innovation, deep empathy, and strong pattern recognition, persistence, and an overall just unique way of thinking. So the goal is not to erase neurodivergence. The goal is to create an environment where people can thrive authentically. So, when support systems are flexible and affirming, neurodivergent individuals can contribute transformative perspectives to schools, workplaces, communities, and all interpersonal relationships. So, I have seen that incredible creativity, when kids feel psychologically, but also just genuinely safe and supported as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so just some overall key takeaways. The goal is not perfection, it is recognition. The goal is a greater curiosity, compassion, and understanding. And so, if there is just one thing that I hope that you all take away from today, is this. So, yes, many individuals are struggling invisibly, and masking can hide that significant distress. And misdiagnosis, it has real consequences. Like these are real people that this impacts. And hide masking individuals, yes, they are very often overlooked. And so early understanding can change long-term outcomes significantly. So the more that we can move away from judgment to curiosity, the more supportive and inclusive our systems can become. And most of all, bottom line is behind many behaviors is a person trying to survive environments that were ultimately not designed for them with their needs in mind. And so I think that that's just very important to take all of this together, different impacts. And I think, that this presentation, of course, it could have been broken down, into so many ways, but I just wanted to make sure that I was incorporating all the different aspects of neurodivergence and misdiagnosis, as well as masking. Because I think that when you hear autism, that you automatically think of more of the lower functioning kids, kids who are nonverbal. And of course, they absolutely need support. So I work with many of those students as well, but at the same time recognizing that autism is a spectrum and there's so many different ways that autism and even ADHD can be presented, and we want to just make sure that none of these kids are being overlooked and that everyone is receiving the supports that they need as a whole. All right, next slide. Okay. All right. So thank you. That was all I had for today. Thank you so much for listening. And I am open to any questions, reflections, or discussion.
Thank you so much, Samantha. This was really, this was incredible. And especially coming from somebody who's an acting clinician, doing this work is great. There are some questions in the chat. Ayeli, were you going to facilitate for Samantha?
Oh, um, and currently we don't have any questions.
Um, okay, so I'm having a hard time hearing Ayeli. I see a lot of really great appreciation of everything you shared. Lots of thanks.
Okay, we have one question. Bringing up culture and masking is a real consideration. Can you elaborate on how you engage those conversations with families that may present a conflict between the two?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So a big part of therapy in general is a intake, that we do at the beginning. And even though usually it can be very lengthy, it's not always very fun for the client themselves because I have to go through so many different questions. But the reason why I mention that is because there is one particular section of the intakes, and this is pretty universal for all of the different programs and organizations that I've worked for, that they always include culture. And as a social worker, cultural competence is a huge part of what we do and making sure that, that we are asking these questions and we're not making any assumptions. So I always ask, cultural background, religion, all of these things. And I make sure, especially for kids, because sometimes they look at me, like, oh, I don't know what my religion is. I have to ask my mom. And so usually it's kind of like just a little fun thing that we talk about. And I like to explain why, because where we come from and what we believe is all a huge part of who we are. And we also know that different cultures, it automatically sometimes can come with different stigmas. Sometimes, certain religions are not okay with therapy. They're not okay with talking about mental health. So I make sure that I'm respecting that most of all. I'm always connecting with the parents, making sure they're aware of, what is, there's confidentiality. So I'm not telling them everything that their kids are saying, but just making sure that they're aware of what is happening, in these therapy sessions and what is being discussed, what I'm working on with the kids, and also working with them on the progress, and what is going on at home. And so I just make sure that I am very non-judgmental, that I am not biased, and that I'm open to working with them and explaining it in different ways that maybe they might understand. And also, usually the biggest bottom line is that I am here to help their child, and I'm here to help them. And so, usually, once they start to get that idea that, that I'm not there to judge them, I'm not taking their kids away from them, all of those things, usually it opens up a really great conversation. And it's usually very positive, thankfully.
Thank you so much for answering that question. We have another one. How can clinicians create environments where clients feel safe being their authentic selves?
That is a great question. So again, being very non-judgmental, non-biased. I mean, for me, I know this isn't the same for every clinician. I am very open, about my experiences. Of course, I set boundaries, and I also understand that what might work for me may not work for them. Everyone is different. Um, but I love to have my fidgets with me, different alternatives to just talk therapy, whether that's coloring, drawing, music, journaling. I mean, there's so many different ways to interact with my clients to where they don't feel like I am just interrogating them or interviewing them. So that is definitely really helpful. And I think another way is just making sure that, the setting itself is very comfortable. Right now, I have the terrible fluorescent lights on just for lighting purposes, but normally they are turned off. I have my lamps on. I have different sensory interactive areas. We even have like a play therapy room downstairs in our office, which is great. So that way kids don't always feel as overwhelmed. But then if I have adults as well, I try to make it really, I guess, very a versatile space for them. And you would be surprised how many of my adults love the fidgets and everything as well. So even my little stands and garden. So just making sure there's a lot of different resources and tools for them. I definitely would say, neutral, not too bright lights, definitely positive, different things in your office so that way that they feel welcome. And yeah, I would say that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any more questions?
Samantha, is there anything else you would like to add?
I would just say again, thank you all for being here. This was an amazing opportunity. I learned so much from all of the other speakers. I will also, I should have done this at the beginning. I didn't include it in my slide. I will definitely add my contact information, my email, if anyone would like to, reach out, if they need any other resources or connections. If you would like any of the resources from our programs, you are more than welcome to reach out. So I will put that in now. And thank you all as well for having me.
Thank you so much.